In this video, we'll be going over staple cards, cards which are usable in pretty much any deck that are of the SR rarity. And I'll be avoiding any of the limited or semi-limited cards because the Master Duel ban list loves to limit some of the really good staples, so those are pretty obviously good by their restricted status. And at number 10, we have Eater of Millions. This is a level 1 monster which can't be normal summoned and can only be special summoned from your hand by banishing 5 more of your cards face down, which can include cards from your hand, field, or extra deck. So normally you bring this card out from your hand by banishing 5 cards from your extra deck that you don't need, and then what this card does in the field is if it's attacking something, you can banish the attack target face down at the start of the damage step. So what's really good about Eater of Millions is how it's just able to remove pretty much any monster in the game, except ones that are just straight up immune to card effects. So if your opponent has some kind of unbeatable boss monster, Eater of Millions can definitely get rid of it, assuming the attack goes through or its effect is not negated. And it also applies its effect if it's attacked by your opponent, but has a soft once per turn. So if your opponent's trying to get rid of Eater of Millions without a card effect, they'll have to attack into it twice before they're able to destroy it by battle. It also has some really niche protection, where it cannot be tributed or uses material for an extra deck summon except for link monsters, which means your opponent can't kaiju the card, and also your opponent can't get rid of it with super polymerization. I'm sure the intended uses of its drawbacks was not to give it some protection, but to make it so you can't use it as an extender. But it unintentionally gives it some protection against common outs to hard to take out boss monsters, even if it is fragile to pretty much everything else. Now, even though Eater of Millions is really good at eating through any boss monster your opponent has, a lot of the best boss monsters have effects that can negate activated effects. So it's not a one-stop shop remove of all of your opponent's boss monsters, but it is a scary threat that your opponent will definitely spend resources to get rid of, if you can afford the main deck space and banishing 5 of your extra deck monsters to use it. And at number 9, we have Ice Dragon's Prison. This is a trap card which allows you to special summon 1 monster from your opponent's graveyard to your side of the field, but its effects are negated. Then you can activate an additional effect, where you can banish 1 monster from both players' fields that have the same type as each other. So the reason Ice Dragon's Prison sees play as a staple is because it can be used for both defense and offense, and because it's a generic, non-target banish. If you're trying to push for a game and you only need a little bit more damage, you can use Ice Dragon's Prison to special summon a monster from your opponent's graveyard, and then just attack with it. More commonly, you'll use it for its banish effect, where you go to special summon a monster from your opponent's graveyard as a type of monster that you wish to banish on the field. Then you'll have the option to non-target banish it, as well as deprive your opponent of a resource from their graveyard. So if your opponent has a particularly nasty monster which is either immune to targeting or destruction effects, or maybe even both, Ice Dragon's Prison is a good way to get rid of it. And since most meta decks will play a whole bunch of monsters of the same type, it should be pretty easy to actually activate the effect of the card against the average meta deck. And because it has the versatility of also being useful as an offensive tool, in addition to a disruption tool, it actually sees competitive play, which is why they made it an SR rarity in Master Duel. And at number 8, we have Sekka's Light. This is a spell card which allows you to draw 2 cards, then if this card is in your graveyard, you can banish it from your graveyard in order to shuffle 1 monster from your hand back into your deck in order to draw another card. So, it's basically a Pot of Greed that also allows you to mulligan 1 card in your hand from your graveyard. So 2 excellent effects, and because this card has such excellent effects, it has some really nasty downsides, where you can't activate its draw 2 effect unless you have no spell or trap cards in your graveyard, and also the card locks you out of using any spell or trap cards for the rest of the duel, except other copies of this card. So if you play Sekka's Light, it's the only spell you're playing in your deck, which is why both of its effects are so generically good. However, the effects were so good that the card is currently limited in the TCG, but unlimited at 3 copies in Master Duel. So if you're playing a deck that has a whole bunch of hand traps and doesn't really use spells and traps anyway, Sekka's Light is the perfect card to be the only spell card in your deck, and preferably at 3 copies. And at number 7, we have Skill Drain. This is a continuous trap card which requires you to pay 1,000 life points to activate it. Then, as long as this card is face-up on the field, it negates the effects of all face-up monsters on the field. It does not negate the effects of monsters anywhere else though, so you can still use hand traps or graveyard effects no problem. Although being able to negate the effects of all monsters on the field forever, or as long as this card stays up on the field, is incredibly powerful, to the point where this card was limited in the TCG for a long time for being too good of a floodgate. And it reigns unlimited in Master Duel, so it's obviously an excellent card to add to your deck if you can play around it, which there are a lot of competitive meta decks doing exactly that. Because most decks in the game are very monster effect heavy and don't play a lot of spell or trap card destruction. So activating a skill drain can just kind of win you the game against certain decks, unless they have a specific spell or trap card in their hand that can answer it immediately. And one of the only reasons they took it off the ban list in the TCG is because the ban list in the TCG is balanced around a best of 3 matches, where you can go into the side deck in order to add more spell or trap card removal. In a best 1 of format like Master Duel, skill drain is kind of overpowered, and I won't be surprised if it's banned from the game in the future. And at number 6, we have Droll and Lockbird. This is a hand trap which has the effect where if your opponent adds a card from their main deck to their hand, except during the draw phase, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to prevent them from doing that again for the rest of the turn. However, unlike Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, which is able to negate a similar thing, Droll and Lockbird can only be used after the effect has already taken place. So it doesn't negate the effect of the card from happening, and simply prevents your opponent from adding any additional cards that turn. Now, this effect seems a lot better than it really is, because there's plenty of meta decks that can totally get by only searching a single time on their turn. But a lot of the really good meta decks are able to search out a whole bunch, and Droll and Lockbird definitely keeps them in check. If you ever see a whole bunch of people maining Droll and Lockbird in the TCG, that usually means there's a whole bunch of overpowered decks in the meta that are probably gonna get on the ban list pretty soon. However, in Master Duel, for some reason, they have Max C available at 3 copies. So a lot of average decks are drawing a whole bunch during certain turns. And Droll and Lockbird can be used in order to stop that from being too much of a problem. However, usually people play Max C during your turn, and Droll and Lockbird also applies to you as well as your opponent. So in the process of stopping your opponent's Max C from drawing too many cards, you might inadvertently stop yourself from being able to search out any of the cards to continue your plays. So there are some drawbacks to the card, but it's still good enough that it's definitely a staple that should be considered to be included in your deck. And at number 5, we have D.D.Crow. This is another hand trap which has the effect where, at any point you want, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to banish 1 card from your opponent's graveyard. So the best use of D.D.Crow is on one of your opponent's cards that they're already activating an effect that targets a monster in the graveyard, like maybe a Monster Reborn for example. Since D.D.Crow's effect is quick effect, you can just chain it in response to those cards in order to remove that target and cause the card to fizzle out, which sends it to the graveyard, wasting the effect. Outside of that little combo, D.D.Crow can also just be used preemptively to remove resources from your opponent's graveyard if they're trying to set it up to do their plays, or get rid of a choice card from the graveyard that keeps them from coming back, like Sky Striker Ace Ray for example. There's also another SR card which has graveyard related hand trap effects called the Skullmeister, which is arguably just as useful as D.D.Crow, and are usually used alongside each other in decks that really want to shut down their opponent's graveyard. And at number 4, we have Evenly Matched. This is a trap card which has the effect where, at the end of the battle phase, you can force your opponent to banish cards they control so that they have the same number of cards that you do on the field. And also, if you control no cards on your side of the field, you can activate this card from your hand. So Evenly Matched is one of the most powerful forms of removal for 2 reasons. First, it forces your opponent to remove the cards from the field, which bypasses pretty much all forms of protection, and it banishes the cards face down, which also bypasses pretty much all forms of floating effects. And since you can just use this from your hand during your turn, if you're going second, it's an excellent card to just get rid of everything on your opponent's side of the field, unless they have a way to negate this specific trap card, which makes Evenly Matched one of the ultimate going second cards, as it can completely win you the game on its own if it resolves, and your opponent has a large enough field, since almost no monster is immune to the effects of Evenly Matched. However, you do need to give up your battle phase in order to do this, and you can only do this going second, after your opponent has already set up their field. If you go first and open Evenly Matched, it's definitely not as useful as if you were going second, so there are some drawbacks to the card. However, the upsides is being one of the best removal cards in the game, period, so I think its few downsides are very warranted. And at number 3, we have Twin Twisters. This is a quick play spell card which simply allows you to discard 1 card from your hand in order to target up to 2 spell or trap cards in the field and destroy them. So, trading 2 cards in your hand to get rid of 2 of your opponent's back row cards, and it can be done during your opponent's turn if you wish, or immediately upon drawing the card. Twin Twisters is the ultimate power crept version of Mystical Space Typhoon, another card which has a similar effect but only targets 1 card and doesn't require you to discard anything. Now, with how much floodgates exist in the game that are not limited or restricted in Master Duel, looking at skill drain from earlier on this list, having a spell and trap card removal is a must. And Twin Twisters is one of the best ones you can have outside of the 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster that's allowed in your deck. Or if you're playing Lightning Storm, which is another really good UR rarity card, which can destroy all of your opponent's spell and traps, but only if you control no cards on your side of the field. Twin Twisters is obviously not as strong as Harpy's Feather Duster, which can pop all of your opponent's back row unconditionally, but it's like the second best thing. It can get rid of up to 2, and it has the option to be used during your opponent's turn if you wish. There's also Cosmic Cyclone, which is a popular option in the SR Rarity, Spell, and Trap card removal category. That is also a quick play spell card, but has the ability to banish a spell or trap card instead of destroying it at the cost of 1000 life points. Both Twin Twisters and Cosmic Cyclone see a lot of heavy use, as do pretty much all the other spell and trap card removal cards, because of just how many floodgates there are in the game currently, and just how useful they are at popping other back row cards as well. And at number 2, we have Knightmare Phoenix. This is a Link 2 monster which can be brought out with any 2 monsters of different names, and has the effect on its summon where you discard 1 card from your hand to destroy 1 spell or trap card your opponent controls. So the reason Knightmare Phoenix is one of the most played Link monsters in the game is because it's super easy to go into in pretty much any deck, and it allows you targeted back row removal, and it's because of this card that a lot of decks don't bother to run main deck spell and trap card removal in the TCG. You do have to discard from your hand in order to use it, but a lot of meta decks can easily facilitate that discard, which is why the previous spot, Twin Twisters, see so much play with little problem. And Knightmare Phoenix also has the added benefit where it can situationally give battle immunity to a Link monster that it's co-linked to, including itself. And it can just be used as a Link climbing tool because there's no restrictions on how you can use it after it uses its effects. So when it hits the field, its effect is usable immediately, so you only have to worry about a negate stopping its effect from happening, and then it can be used later on to go into a bigger, better boss monster. And the most important thing is having all of these useful features while being versatile in how you can bring it out, with just any 2 monsters of different names, including tokens. And at number 1, we have Pot of Desires. This is a normal spell card which allows you to draw 2 cards, but at the cost of banishing the top 10 cards of your deck face down. You can only use one of these cards once per turn, so the worst possible thing you can do with Pot of Desires is draw into 2 other copies of Pot of Desires with its effect. Because normally you only want to resolve 1 Pot of Desires per duel anyway, because banishing 10 cards from your deck face down is kind of a steep cost, but is definitely worth it for the effect at least once. However, having to do it again might be a lot more costly, and rarely will you even be able to resolve the effect 3 times in a duel. Either way, most people do opt to play through copies just to have an increased chance of drawing at least one of them, because being able to draw 2 cards for 1 is just a pure +1 in card advantage that can extend pretty much any play, as there are very few decks where Pot of Desires is bad in, and every deck benefits from a generic +1 in card advantage, especially if that +1 is just pure drawing, which is why Pot of Extravagance is also a heavily played staple, which is also in the SR Rarity. Pot of Extravagance also allows you to draw 2 cards, but at the cost of only being usable at the start of your main phase 1, you have to banish 6 cards from your extra deck face down randomly, and you can't draw any other cards for the rest of the turn. And Pot of Extravagance is played just as much as Pot of Desires, because being able to draw +2 cards generically from your deck is good in pretty much any deck. Although Pot of Extravagance is a lot harder to use than Pot of Desires, because you don't really want to risk banishing any key extra deck monsters if your deck really needs your extra deck. If you don't really need your extra deck, Pot of Extravagance is probably better to play than Pot of Desires, so you don't have to worry about banishing key combo points from your main deck. Then there's also Pot of Prosperity, which is another SR pot card which is played just as much as the other 2, but isn't a generic +1. The way Pot of Prosperity works is you can banish 3 to 6 cards from your extra deck face down of your choice, then you look at the top cards of your deck equal to the amount of cards you banished, and you get to add 1 of those cards to your hand. Then you place the other ones on the bottom of your deck in any order, and all damage your opponent takes for the rest of this turn is cut in half. Pot of Prosperity also has a hard once per turn on its effect, and also prevents you from drawing other cards for the rest of the turn. And the reason you would play Pot of Prosperity over the other 2 is because it gives you more choice in which cards you're actually adding to your hand, if you're only looking for one specific piece. So these 3 pot cards, all of the SR Rarity, are all very good staples that are usable in a very wide variety of decks. And the one you use is pretty much dependent on which kind of deck you're playing, as rarely do decks play all 3 of these cards. In the SR Rarity, there's also Pot of Avarice and Pot of Duality, which occasionally see play but aren't as generic to use as the previous 3 I just talked about. Alright, and that's the list. Since Master Duel puts pretty much all of their best staples in the high rarities, this list looks pretty much like a TCG list of staple cards. So if you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, specifically Master Duel related, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.